how Squeaky Anderson, the beachmaster, had done this or that, and even the Admiral's actions were not above examination. But this day there was no levity aboard the Cambria, for Harry Hill was making a vital decision. In the end he stuck with what he knew to be right, and prepared to lay his career on the line. Turner had ordered him flatly to stop planning for the White Beaches. Instead, Hill split his staff in two, half working on the White Beaches plan, half working on the Tinian Town plan. J-Day, the day to go in, was set for July 12th by Turner. It would be July 24th. On July 24th, Hill went back to Admiral Turner, who refused to listen to any talk about the White Beaches. Then Hill swallowed hard and began his desperate foray. He took his plan for the White Beaches to Holland Smith. Smith liked it. With that backing, Hill took the plan over Turner's head to Admiral Spruance. The senior admiral said he approved. Then Spruance said he would call a meeting to settle the matter, and Hill agreed. They met aboard the Indianapolis. Major General Schmidt, Major General Watson of the 2nd Marines, Major General Clifton Cates of the 4th Marines, Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, and Rear Admiral Hill, all sitting around Spruance's conference table. Hill laid out his plan. They discussed it as he looked sidelong at Kelly Turner. Then Spruance called for votes. Admiral Hill breathed a long sigh of relief, but he was not out of the woods yet. Having forced the issue with Turner, it was imperative that the plan succeed, said Hill. He went back to the Cambria and redoubled his efforts to make sure there were no holes in the White Beaches plan. A few days before the scheduled invasion, Commander Louis W. Mang came to see Hill. Mang was an academy graduate, and his father was a friend of Hill's from the distant days when Hill had been teaching at the academy. In 1944, Mang was an aviator sent out from the States to field test a new device, the napalm bomb. He showed Admiral Hill how airplane wing tanks could be converted into firebombs by filling them with napalm and fusing them. Hill was intrigued. In the battle for Saipan, the Japanese had contested each yard of territory more ferociously than ever before. One reason Hill wanted to move into the White Beaches in the northwest rather than the broad beaches of the south at Tinian Town. Surprise was a weapon of value. So, it seemed, could be this new napalm. The idea of fire was not new. The Marines were using fire from flamethrowers to burn Japanese soldiers in their caves and blockhouses, but the use that Mang outlined was staggering in its potential. Admiral Hill ordered 8,500 pounds of napalm from Pearl Harbor by airplane, and the imperturbable men of the service force accepted this recondite demand and fulfilled it without a hitch. Commander Mang began building his bombs at Aslito airfield. When the first bombs were ready, Hill brought Spruance, Turner, and the Marine generals aboard a destroyer and took them down near Tinian Town for an exhibition. Mang hooked his bombs to a P-51 fighter, and the plane took off, the pilot instructed to come in low and fast and skip-bomb his target, which was on a piece of flat land near the shore. The run was made, the improvised bomb was dropped, and the field that was the target suddenly erupted in flame as though a gunpowder fuse were being lighted, except that instead of flaming up and going out, the napalm burned and burned and burned. From the flagship, Hill measured the strip burned by the one bomb. It was 100 yards long and 30 yards wide. Having convinced the Japanese even more firmly by such activity that Tinian Town was the target, Hill continued to plan for the Little Beaches. On July 17th, the plan was issued. It included the use of portable ramps and floating gas stations, ideas that had been wild dreams a few months earlier. Meanwhile, on July 21st, Rear Admiral Richard Connolly made the long-delayed landing on Guam, marked by the longest sustained bombardment of the war to date, 13 days, conducted with great skill by Admiral Connolly. It was the most effective naval bombardment of the war, too, knocking out nearly every emplacement that was not either buried or mobile. Marine Major General R.S. Geiger was in charge of the troops, and he comported himself brilliantly in the field against very heavy Japanese opposition. The Marianas represented full-scale fighting. The Japanese staged tank counterattacks and fought with big guns all the way. By the end of the fighting, the Americans had put 54,000 men in the field to account for 19,000 Japanese. General Geiger said that organized resistance ended on August 10th, but resistance never did end. 8,500 of those Japanese were killed or captured after August 10th, and even at the time of the Japanese surrender in 1945, a lieutenant colonel and 113 officers and men were still at large on the island. On J1 or July 23rd, Admiral Hill divided Tinian into 5 sectors for bombardment purposes. Very heavy attention was given to Tinian town to persuade the Japanese that the Americans were indeed coming into those heavily mined and fortified beaches. A single cruiser worked over the White Beach area, but the battleship Colorado banged away at Phoebus San Hilo Point, destroying a battery of 3 140 mm guns, which could have played hob with the landing next day. After all, the White Beaches were so narrow that not more than 8 landing craft could land abreast. Hill sent minesweepers in to comb the area around Tinian town, again to increase the illusion that this would be the landing place. Next morning, the troops began to land. Transports carrying the 2nd Marine Division moved off the beaches of Tinian town, and the Marines climbed down into landing craft, which sped in toward shore at 0730 hours. The Japanese opened fire with mortars, and a mile off the beach the landing craft reversed and went back to the transports. The landing had failed. Indeed it had, just as this fake landing was supposed to fail, further leading the Japanese to believe Tinian town was the target, and to persuade Admiral Kakuta and Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata to concentrate the island's 9,000 defenders in that area. The Japanese were further exhilarated by their own good artillery shooting. Their coastal guns here scored 6 hits on destroyer Norman Scott and 22 hits on the Colorado, killing some 60 men, including the captain of the destroyer, and wounding nearly 150 more. Meanwhile, the real landings were beginning on the White Beaches to the northwest, the first wave of Amphtrax hitting the beach at 0750 and 14 waves following on their heels. 2 Amphtrax were knocked out by mines on White 2, but the landings were comparatively easy. Only 15 officers and men were killed on both beaches. 2 unhurt pillboxes caused some trouble on White 2, and so did some more mines, but the Marines kept coming in and moving on. That evening the portable ramps began to go into place, and next morning loaded trucks could roll directly out of LSTs onto the land. By the close of J-Day, 15,614 Marines, soldiers and sailors were ashore. It was the beginning of what Admiral Spruance called the most brilliantly conceived and executed amphibious operation of the war. On J+1, the Japanese staged a strong counterattack, but it failed. On J+4, the first planes landed on the airstrip. On J+8, Tinian was secured. The cost was 389 Americans killed and 1,816 wounded, against more than 5,000 Japanese killed and a handful taken prisoner. Even these figures, as always, represented only the American count. There had been 9,000 defenders. What happened to the other 4,000 Japanese? Some escaped, but most must have committed suicide deep in the caves where they were hidden. At the end, as the Japanese and their supporters were driven to the high ground that overlooked the sea in the southern part of the island, Harry Hill watched a drama that had been played also on Saipan and on Guam. The Japanese were trying to effect a mass suicide. The Americans brought up a public address system on a jeep to talk to the crowd on the plateau 200 feet above the sea, a crowd of Japanese soldiers and thousands of civilian men, women and children. Japanese language officers spoke to them, asking them to give up. They would not be hurt. The Japanese answer came when a dozen soldiers threw themselves over the cliff into the sea. The Japanese language officers spoke again. A Japanese blew himself up with a grenade. Another grenade went off in a crowd of soldiers and civilians, and it seemed to set off some kind of bomb, for dozens of arms, legs and torsos were suddenly cascaded bloodily into the air. Then the civilians ran for the American line to surrender. The remainder of the Japanese soldiers fled to caves or to leap over the cliff, and the affair was over. Almost anywhere one looked in the summer of 1944, there was furious activity. Admiral Clark concocted and conducted a brilliant raid on the volcano islands, Iwo and Jima, netting scores of planes and a whole convoy of ships before he was finished. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral William Halsey was organizing his Third Fleet, which would employ the same ships and planes as the Fifth Fleet. The difference would be that Halsey and his staff would take out the Third Fleet, with Vice Admiral McCain as commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, which would, under him, be known as Task Force 38. Meanwhile, Spruance would come ashore to plan with his staff for his next operation, and Admiral Mitcher would also leave the fleet with Spruance. The plan was to alternate the commands, thus using the same ships for tasks that followed each other like clockwork. On June 15th, Halsey was detached officially from the South Pacific, and Vice Admiral Newton took over. 3 days later, Halsey was ensconced in offices in the new JICPOA building, Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Areas, planning for the occupation of the Western Caroline Islands. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were still talking about the route to Tokyo. Admiral King was committed to the idea of bypassing the Philippines and mounting the next major offensive against Formosa. He ordered Nimitz to draw up such a plan, and reluctantly Nimitz put Forrest Sherman to work on it. Sherman drew up the plan, but he hated it. He said he hoped he had drawn such a bad plan that it would be thrown out, because he believed that to move against Formosa without first taking at least Luzon in the Philippines, with all its available airfields and supplies, would be to court annihilation in Formosa with attacks from 2 fronts. But what to do? Everybody seemed to have a different idea. Nimitz wanted to take the Western Carolines first, then invade the central Philippines and Iwo Jima. Halsey wanted to bypass the Carolines, then take the central Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Japan. Spruance wanted to go to the Carolines, but not Yap, and then to Nimrod Sound, south of Shanghai. Kelly Turner talked of going directly to Japan with a huge amphibious force. MacArthur, of course, was steadfast in his plan, to move to Luzon, take the Philippines, reconquer the Netherlands, East Indies, and roll up the Japanese Empire from the south. Admiral King was as firm for his plan as MacArthur was for his, and Nimitz, as a loyal commander, was in the position of having to support the King plan whether he agreed with it or not. This point was made very clear in King's letter of February 8, 1944, to Nimitz, in which King berated the Pacific and South Pacific commanders and staff for not uniformly supporting his idea of bypassing the Philippines. The result of the pulling and hauling was that in the summer of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt decided to make a trip to the Pacific and settle the question for himself. It was an election year, to be sure, and there were people who considered Roosevelt's trip a grandstand play. But the fact of the very basic disagreement among many strategists could not be denied. The visit was well planned. Secret Service agents came in advance and okayed the mansion on Diamond Head made available to the president. Nimitz sent a message inviting General MacArthur to come to Hawaii. MacArthur replied that he was too busy. King asked MacArthur to come. MacArthur was still too busy. General Marshall then ordered MacArthur to come, and he set out with 5 members of his staff. King came to Pearl Harbor just before the president arrived, but since he was definitely not invited to this meeting, King hurriedly left for the Central Pacific on an inspection tour. MacArthur arrived by plane on July 26th, a few minutes before the president's ship, the cruiser Baltimore, came into harbor. Nimitz had asked MacArthur to stay with him in the house on Makalapa, but the messages had somehow been garbled, and MacArthur ended up believing he had only an invitation from General Richardson, which he accepted. In the meetings that were to follow, Roosevelt apparently intended to discover for himself just what his field commanders planned. They sat in a big room filled with maps of the Pacific, and Nimitz took up a pointer and stepped to the map to present the Navy plan, to bypass the Philippines and attack Formosa. MacArthur, feeling that he would be confined to a backwater command if this plan was followed, then presented his old Reno plan. It was a most forceful presentation, since he knew the plan very well and had for some time. When the meetings were over, no one was quite certain what President Roosevelt was thinking about the future. Several decisions were made. The president did favour MacArthur's march into the Philippines for emotional and high political reasons. MacArthur and Nimitz agreed on one vital aspect of the coming campaigns. MacArthur must have fleet and logistical support from the Pacific Fleet in future operations. At a special meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in August, Admiral Leahy outlined the discussions at Pearl Harbor. We had a special meeting of the Joint Chiefs in which I gave them a detailed report of the Honolulu conferences. They may have been somewhat surprised to learn that Nimitz and MacArthur said they had no disagreements at the moment, and they could work out their joint plans in harmony. But, and it was a very big but, the final decision on Pacific operations, especially in the matter of an assault on Japan itself, would have to be made by the Commander-in-Chief. Commander-in-Chief in this sense meant the President, not King as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. In fact, there was a basic change of emphasis this summer. Although the President had always previously been accompanied on trips abroad by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had chosen to go to Pearl Harbor with only Leahy, his aide Wilson Brown, and his military aide General Watson. A bit earlier, Leahy had suggested that Admiral King stop using the term Commander-in-Chief, because Roosevelt, who was by definition Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces, wanted to use that designation. Some writers have since said that the impulse was political, in view of the 1944 presidential campaign. In any event, Admiral King resisted the idea, demanding an outright order to stop using the title, and nothing more was ever heard of it. The presidential visit brought some new problems to Pearl Harbor to make Nimitz's head spin. Roosevelt announced that he was coming to the Macalapa House for lunch the second day. The Secret Service men rushed up to the house and ordered it virtually rebuilt. Doors were to be rehung, bathrooms rebuilt, and even a roadway put behind the house because Roosevelt was sensitive about anyone seeing him get into and out of cars. On the day of the luncheon, 500 men of a CB battalion came to the Admiral's house and began taking it apart. They repainted what was necessary and dried the paint with blowtorches. At noon they were gone, and no one would have known they had even been there, as Roosevelt sat down to drink a couple of martinis and eat a luncheon of mahi-mahi, the Hawaiian fish. Lamar, Nimitz's aide, said he counted 136 stars on the collars of the general and flag officers at that lunch that day. The Navy's strategic plan for 1944 seemed still to be in effect, although nobody was really certain of what had happened. MacArthur went back to the South, feeling that he had won his battle. He feels that he has the President's and Admiral Leahy's assurances that Luzon will not be bypassed. Artemus Gates wrote James Forrestal, who had become Secretary of the Navy upon Knox's death. But 2 months after the meetings in Hawaii, MacArthur was still not certain that he had won. That was Franklin Roosevelt's way. Nimitz was extremely busy with new problems. Sparked by Admiral Radford's suggestions, the Navy was planning for a night-operating carrier division. Planes from a night-operating carrier might very well have discovered the Japanese fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The development of the planes and the techniques was an indication of the rapid movement of the naval science of carrier operation. At the end of July, Admiral Pownall left Pearl Harbor, bound for Pensacola and a shore job. He went to see Nimitz before he left, trying to find a place for himself in the Pacific, but there was no room. The younger fighting admirals of the carrier forces had taken over. On August 8th, Nimitz was off to Guam for a tour, accompanied by General Vandergrift, who had come out from Washington, and Forrest Sherman. One reason for the tour was to look over the terrain and harbours, and the possible use of Guam as an advanced fleet headquarters. Nimitz found the build-up of his staff and everything else at Pearl Harbor very trying. So many hundreds of officers had joined his staff that he could not possibly know them all well, as he had known the original group back in 1942. The change was inevitable, with the growth of the fleet and the vigorous prosecution of the war. Its proportions can be indicated by the fact that not only was there a complete logistics section of the staff, headed by a rear admiral, but there was an assistant chief of staff for logistics, who in turn, unhappily and unnecessarily, had his own executive assistant, a planning section, a transportation section, a construction section, an ordnance section, an administrative section, and a statistical section. By this time, an absolutely vital element in the invasion plans was the service force of Vice Admiral Calhoun. Everything the Americans used had to be brought with them, and the responsibility for sorting it out and bringing it was Calhoun's. This meant the finding and use of provision ships, tankers, ammunition ships, and a dozen other types. The big natural base at Eniwetok was used fully as a staging area, and millions of tons of supplies would pass through there. In the Marianas operation alone, for example, nearly 200 supply ships were to be employed by the forces of Admiral Spruance. One of the major reasons for the Marianas move was to create a staging area for development of stockpiles within 1,000 miles of the scene of the coming 1945 operations. The service squadrons remain largely unsung in the history of the war, like the Quartermaster Corps of the Army, but without them the Navy could never have moved in the conquest of the Pacific. Nimitz, of course, had his own reason for wanting to go to Guam, besides the huge pile-up of administrative detail. He wanted to be much closer to the scene of operations. In conferences at Pearl Harbor that summer, King had squelched the idea of movement into the Philippines. He did not want to hear any more about the Philippines, he told Nimitz when he visited Pearl just before Roosevelt came, until Nimitz and his people had surveyed the possibility of using Eniwetok and Guam as bases for moving directly to Formosa. As Halsey moved out in August to take command of the Third Fleet and of the operation against the Western Carolines, the future was still not settled. But it was soon to be settled, and on September 9th, Halsey had copies of orders for the invasion of the Philippines. Halsey went to sea to rendezvous with Mark Mitcher's task force, because McCain was still ashore at Pearl Harbor trying to assemble a staff. Admiral Towers was trying to help him. Towers, at this time, was being pushed into the background in the operations out of Pearl, although as Nimitz's deputy he had expected to exert more influence than he had had before as commander of the Air Force. Towers put the blame for this state of affairs on Forrest Sherman, whom he had brought to the command in the first place. New pressures were put on Nimitz. Secretary Forrestal was not at all happy with Navy public relations. The public has only a very inadequate and hazy impression of what the Navy has done in this war, he wrote Nimitz. The failure was the Navy's own inadequacy in public relations. Part of this stems from the nature of Army and Navy training, but not all of it, he said. He also said of the Army commanders, with obvious reference to Eisenhower and MacArthur, they are all pretty good dialecticians. Nimitz, who had recently experienced in the MacArthur-Roosevelt visit an exposure to that dialectic expertise, had very little to say. Nor would it have done him much good to argue, for Forrestal had long felt strongly about the deficiencies of the Navy's public relations, and was determined to make some basic changes. In the Guam operation, as an example of this change, Nimitz had visited the island at the end of the campaign and held a press conference with General Geiger. It was a friendly affair. Geiger had recently liberated a number of cases of Suntory whiskey, a Japanese product that tasted almost exactly like Scotch. Robert Trumbull of the New York Times, formerly of the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, asked with a twinkle what the general had there. "Don't you think, General," said Nimitz with a grin that proved there was nothing wrong with his public relations, "we could make one case available to the press?" One case was made available, and the correspondents lugged it over to the tent, where they quaffed and wrote their stories. Admiral Nimitz's plane was to leave for Pearl Harbor the following morning, and Lamar agreed to take the press copy back to Pearl and give it to Captain Drake for dispatch. Departure was to be at 0700 sharp. Next morning, however, the plane took off about 0600, and McArdle, the public relations man there, did not even have the copy yet. He put it on the next plane to Pearl, which should have arrived the following day, but it did not. Nimitz reached Pearl Harbor, and the Pearl Harbor commandos came over for a press conference. They got the stories, they were filed, and when the stories of the combat correspondents in the field came in, they were suitable for nothing but the wastebasket. In the forward areas, there was also considerable public relations friction. The Army Air Forces, and particularly the 7th Air Force, under General Hale, were having their difficulties with the Navy. Admiral Hoover claimed that Hale's boys bombed from too far up and exaggerated their victories. Hoover did not care for their performance at all. Furthermore, he objected to Hale's methods of garnering publicity. McArdle was assigned to Hoover's command at the end of the Marianas operation, and Hoover instructed his new public relations officer. "I don't care about publicity myself," he said. "There are certain people who have had publicity all out of proportion to their achievements. As long as I am in command here, I want to see to it that credit is fairly distributed. I want you to censor all press material originating in this area, and I want to see every line that is written about General Hale." One of the basic causes of friction in that combined command was opposite attitudes toward publicity. The Air Force made sure that its activities were known in every corner of the United States, and it accomplished this aim by sending out thousands and thousands of personal stories to hometown papers. The Navy was far behind. That message was being pounded home in the Navy Department in Washington. Particularly with the expansion of the operations, the correspondents were becoming restless. They did not like the uncertain transportation, the muddled censorship, because there were not enough censors, and the poor communications. In August, Nimitz noted that Captain H.B. Miller was going to come out to Pearl to look over the photographic situation. Miller was an airman, and also a graduate of the Naval Academy of the class of 1924, a former assistant naval attaché in London, and director of training literature for the Bureau of Aeronautics. He arrived in Pearl Harbor just as the Western Carolines operation began, and he took over public relations. Captain Drake was out on the Palau invasion. Captain Miller moved into Captain Drake's office and moved Lieutenant Commander Alan Bosworth out into the anteroom from behind Waldo Drake's desk. When Drake heard of the change, at Saipan, he took off for Pearl Harbor. He found that his desk had indeed been usurped. He moved a new desk in, alongside Captain Miller's. Captain Miller ordered the desk moved out, and Captain Drake ordered it moved back in again. Then the Cold War began. If someone called for the public relations officer and Captain Drake answered the phone, he would say, "I am the public relations officer." If someone called for the public relations officer and Captain Miller answered the phone, he would say, "Speaking." And so it went, with the callers growing ever more confused. Captain Drake conferred with Admiral Nimitz, who told him that he, Nimitz, considered Drake the public relations officer, but that Secretary Forrestal, who was in charge, considered that Captain Miller held that title. Whereupon Captain Drake went back to Washington to straighten out affairs, and was never again seen at Pearl Harbor. Forrestal shanghaied him, kept him in Washington, and was soon talking of sending him over to the Office of War Information, where they had been asking for someone who knew something about the Pacific. Captain Miller began moving out the old public relations team and moving in a new one, which would eventually number several hundred officers and men. In spite of such monumental struggles at headquarters, the war continued. The operation from which Captain Drake had come back was the successful invasion of the Palaus, 530 miles from the southern Philippines, halfway from Guam to Mindanao. Vice Admiral McCain was scheduled to be Mitch's replacement, but he needed some experience in new carrier techniques, so in the summer's operations McCain was given Clark's task group, now called Task Group 38.1. The lineup was changed considerably at this point. Reeves, Clark, Harrell and Montgomery were all given a rest, and Rear Admiral G.F. Bogan took Reeves's force, Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman took Montgomery's force, and Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison took Harrell's. The force was also changed a bit. 2 more carriers were added, for a total of 17. On August 28th, Halsey sailed from Eniwetok, the big advance fleet base. Incidentally, and rather more than that as far as the war is concerned, the task forces had been out raiding ever since the capture of the Marianas was assured, and their presence was no longer needed offshore. Halsey went out full of fire and brimstone to hit Yap, the Palaus, and Mindanao. He found that the Japanese air power was so slight as to scarcely constitute a challenge. The task force roamed where it would and bombed and strafed at will. On September 12th and 13, the force flew off 2,400 sorties, knocking out an estimated 200 planes, sinking ships from merchantmen to sampans, and blowing up buildings. The opposition was so slight that on September 13th, Halsey suggested that the landings at Morotai, the Palay, and Mindanao be cancelled as not needed to soften up the Philippines, which was their purpose. It was too late to stop Morotai and the Palaus. The invasion forces were already underway. General MacArthur's landing on Morotai was a direct result of the July conference at Pearl Harbor. It was to be a stepping-off place for the assault on Mindanao that MacArthur proposed to make. Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbé was the amphibious commander, working under Vice Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet. Rear Admiral William M. Fechteler handled part of the invasion. Rear Admiral R.S. Berkey commanded the support group, which consisted of 5 American and Australian cruisers and 10 American and Australian destroyers. Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague had 6 escort carriers for air support, and Nimitz lent McCain's Task Group 38.1 to MacArthur for D-Day operations. Some 28,000 troops under Major General Charles P. Hall of the Nixon Corps were landed. There were difficulties in landing, but they were caused by insufficient knowledge of the beaches. As far as Japanese resistance was concerned, it was a walkaway. At the end of 2 weeks, only a few Japanese had been killed or captured. Rear Admiral T.S. Wilkinson was in command of the amphibious force, with General Geiger in charge of the land operations. A dozen admirals and general officers were involved in the landings, a reflection of the power that was building up in the Pacific. The fight for Peleliu was very tough. The Marines suffered 3,900 casualties in knocking out the 5,300 Japanese on the island. At the end of a week, the issue was no longer in doubt in any way, but it took the Marines almost until December 1st to wipe out the opposition of the Japanese on Peleliu. On Angkor, 1,600 Japanese fought fiercely, but their conditions were not the same. The island was secured in a month, and American bombers were operating from the field by October 21st. Ulithi was occupied without opposition, and Vice Admiral Hoover took over the development of an advanced fleet base here. Scrappy Kessing, for whom Admiral Halsey had fought so brisk a battle with the personnel people in the Guadalcanal days, became the base commander. Although the decisions in the Roosevelt-MacArthur-Nimitz meetings in Pearl Harbor had been so fuzzy that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were still arguing about them weeks later, Nimitz and MacArthur did undertake the kind of cooperation Roosevelt wanted. No one said the Navy accepted MacArthur's Reno 5 plan, which called for the Navy to throw in the towel in the Central Pacific and support MacArthur in the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies, any more than the Army would support the Navy's Granite 2 plan, which called for the Central Pacific drive to forge ahead while MacArthur took the back seat. What they had agreed upon was that MacArthur would take Morotai on September 15th and Nimitz would take Peleliu. MacArthur would move into Mindanao on November 15th and Leyte on December 20th. Then would come the big question mark. Would the Central Pacific drive be followed to Formosa and Amoy by March 1st, 1945, or would MacArthur lead the way to Manila by February 20th? Roosevelt, Churchill, and the combined Chiefs of Staff met at Quebec on September 11, 1944, as the Morotai and Peleliu operations were already committed and the forces rode at sea. These military leaders discussed the opposing Army and Navy views. The British took no position, regarding the matter as an American problem. Their concern was with Churchill's request that Britain be made a full partner in the war against Japan, and when that was granted, they made no comments on the strategy. The combined chiefs recommended that the target date for the end of the war with Japan be set for 18 months after the defeat of Germany, and that once the Germans had surrendered, in cooperation with other Pacific powers and with Russia, all available resources be thrown into the struggle to crush Japan. The American Joint Chiefs agreed to this, but it was not the Navy position or Leahy's position. The Army did not appear to be able to understand, Leahy wrote later, that the Navy, with some Army air assistance, already had defeated Japan. The Army not only was planning a huge land invasion of Japan, but was convinced that we needed Russian assistance as well to bring the war against Japan to a successful conclusion. In Halsey's strikes against the Philippines, a young pilot from Task Group 38.1 was shot down off Leyte. He was Ensign Thomas C. Tiller from the carrier Hornet. The lucky pilot was rescued by Filipinos who informed him that there were no Japanese in the Leyte area. When Ensign Tiller was picked up by a PBY and returned to the Hornet, he went to see Admiral McCain and Admiral Clark, who was still riding along as advisor while McCain learned the ropes. Clark immediately informed Admiral Halsey of the report. As the top admirals and generals talked in Quebec, Halsey came to the conclusion that the Japanese had been all but knocked out in the Philippines. He was wrong. Admiral Onishi of the 1st Air Fleet was saving his strength for the invasion of the Philippines, which was now fully expected. Halsey sent messages to Nimitz and to MacArthur, suggesting changes. MacArthur was at sea, but his staff functioned very well in such matters. General Sutherland knew his commander's mind, and agreed almost offhand to the advancement of the Leyte invasion by 2 months, to October 20th, if the Joint Chiefs approved. The chiefs, advised of this at dinner in Quebec, interrupted the festivities long enough to hold a quick meeting and agreed to bypass all other targets and move to Leyte on that schedule. The matter actually was of so little moment to them, engaged in their problems of high strategy, that Admiral Leahy does not even mention it in his book in connection with the Second Quebec Conference. Just after the middle of September, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman and Brigadier General W.B. Riley of the Marines met at Hollandia to discuss the role the Third Fleet would play in the Leyte operation. Sherman was Admiral Nimitz's War Plans officer. General Riley was Halsey's War Plans officer. Halsey would have command of the forward area, except the Marshal's Gilbert's area. Plans had been made to turn over a large number of ships to Kinkaid's 7th Fleet for the coming operations. Some of these, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, were to be returned later. The escort cruisers in the 3rd Fleet were to be given to the 7th Fleet, but this order was conditional on need. The general outline of Nimitz's directive and Halsey's operation plan was laid out. The 3rd Fleet will cover and support the occupation of Leyte by destroying enemy naval and air forces in or threatening the Philippines area, and will provide cover for sea and air communications and for newly established bases in the forward areas. The covering and striking forces will remain free to strike targets of opportunity and to conduct such offensive operations as will best exploit initial success in planned operations or will best counter enemy operations. Then came the details. Sortie on D-13, fuel on D-11. Carrier strikes D-10 to D-7 on Okinawa, Formosa, or northern Luzon, Halsey to decide. Move to refueling zone on D6, fuel on D5, then from D4 to D-Day make carrier strikes on the Luzon-Bicol area, and the area in support of the landing in the Leyte area. Western Task Force, 3rd Fleet, beginning on D+1 day, and thereafter will operate in strategic support of the operation, effecting strikes as the situation at that time requires. Finally, the memo indicated Halsey would effect necessary measures of details in coordination with MacArthur, Kinkaid, and the commanding general of the Far East Air Forces. The plan was settled. MacArthur's Navy, Admiral Kinkaid and the 7th Fleet, was to support the landings on Leyte. In previous landings in which the Central Pacific forces were involved, Admiral Spruance had been in charge of the entire operation. But this case was more like the old system under which Halsey had operated with MacArthur in the past. The Central Pacific Force had no responsibility for the landings, but was in strategic and tactical support of those landings. It would be a very important difference, for the result was to create a divided command, in which Admiral Halsey and Admiral Kinkaid each believed himself in a position to make independent judgments, a very dangerous situation indeed in the face of a brave and determined enemy. "Thank heavens Halsey and Mick Carney have stepped into the driver's seat," wrote Admiral Towers in the middle of September. Towers was just back from the Marianas, where he had nearly been shot while riding in a jeep along Guam's dusty roads. He was happy to have even this questionable respite, for the constant warfare within the staff of the Pacific Fleet was getting on Towers' nerves. He was, slowly but surely, being pushed into the background, and he resented it. While Forrest Sherman was off in Hollandia conferring with General Riley, Towers sought the chance to have a long, frank talk with Nimitz about the relationships in the command. He sensed that Sherman had Nimitz's respect and liking, and was occupying the position that Towers had hoped to have himself when he became deputy to the commander of the fleet. But instead of being busy, like Sherman, with the coming operations, Towers found himself concerned about seeds and fertilizer for the natives of the Marianas, or about the development of the Guam Forward Headquarters, which was to accommodate 600 officers and 2,000 men. Nimitz was still worrying about the post-Leyte plans, which were very fluid. It now appears certain that General MacArthur will be ordered to conduct his Luzon operation in December, Nimitz wrote Halsey on September 24th. Plans for subsequent operations are not firm and will unquestionably be affected considerably by the degree of success which you achieve in your first strikes north of the Philippines. 4 days later, Halsey wrote Nimitz a letter about various operations and tactical plans, in which he stated very completely his philosophy of battle. Halsey had sat restlessly in Nimitz's headquarters as Spruance had come so near, yet been so far, from engaging the main Japanese fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Halsey had determined then, and it was always his basic point of view, that if he had a chance to destroy the Japanese fleet with his fast carrier task force, he would move in and do so without fail. I feel that every weapon in the Pacific should be brought to bear if and when the enemy fleet sorties, he wrote Nimitz. He was uneasy about strategic considerations, particularly the submarines. The dispositions outlined in your messages appear to leave gaps. Key Channel and Shimonoseki Strait are unguarded, the subs stationed. Near Yokosuka and Sasebo are operating so close under enemy shore-based air that their ability to contact and trail is questioned. There appears to be a sizable gap between the Maru Morgue and the Formosa boats. Those apparent weaknesses in the disposition might result in the enemy fleet gaining the open sea without my receiving early and vital information. He gave warning of his plans. As mentioned in one of my early dispatches, I intend, if possible, to deny the enemy a chance to outrange me in an air duel, and also to deny him an opportunity to employ an air shuttle, carrier to target to land, against me. If I am to prevent his gaining that advantage, I must have early information, and I must move smartly. Inasmuch as the destruction of the enemy fleet is the principal task, every weapon should be brought into play and the general coordination of those weapons should be in the hands of the tactical commander responsible for the outcome of the battle. I hope that you will forgive this lengthy discussion. My goal is the same as yours, to completely annihilate the Japanese fleet if the opportunity offers. As Halsey wrote, Nimitz was on his way to San Francisco for the autumn meeting with King to determine the strategy of the months to come. King restated his arguments. He wanted the Formosa operation to support a China invasion, Japanese-held coast. He did not like the Army plan of putting a land force into Kyushu until and unless the Army and Navy were ready to launch a large Tokyo plane operation. But what he really wanted to avoid was huge casualties. Yet King was discouraged, because a study had indicated that until Germany surrendered, there simply were not the resources available to launch an attack against Formosa, where the formidable Kwantung Army had gone into garrison. Formosa might have to be bypassed. Nimitz then tentatively offered a new plan, noting that it was based on the non-availability of resources to do what King wanted — one always had to be very careful with King — and the extremely favourable results of recent carrier operations. The plan called for support of MacArthur's Luzon operation on December 20th, and then moves against Nanpo Shoto on January 20th by the Central Pacific Forces, and against Nansei Shoto on March 1st, 1945. To quote from the conference minutes, Admiral Nimitz stated that the proposal for the SWPA forces to work up through the Philippines from Leyte by shore-to-shore operations was discussed with the President and General MacArthur in July. General MacArthur stated that he could not do these operations. Accordingly, because of insufficient resources for Formosa, he, Admiral Nimitz, came to the view that the best way to keep pressure on the Japanese was for him to support the Lingayen Gulf operation proposed by MacArthur and to take Nanpo Shoto and Nansei Shoto with POA, Pacific Ocean Area forces. Admiral Sherman said it would take at least until March to move on Formosa, even if the supplies could be made available. Admiral Cook, who represented King's point of view, said they really ought not to throw out the Formosa operation. King asked if it would not be possible to get MacArthur into Leyte and hold him there, and then do Formosa by taking over MacArthur's remaining forces. Admiral Cook said that according to the army, there would still not be enough resources for Formosa. King asked what they would do if they let MacArthur have his Luzon operation. Where would the Central Pacific forces go next? Sherman said the thing to do was eliminate the Japanese air strength in Formosa by a series of carrier strikes, just as they had done already in the Philippines. Also, he said, a big carrier strike against Japan proper was being planned for November 5th. Halsey would range far and wide in support of the Leyte operations. Then Iwo Jima could be taken with 2 divisions, the airfields built up there in a hurry by using a huge Seabee force, and on March 1st, having neutralized Formosan air strength by carrier attacks, the invasion of Okinawa would begin. Nimitz said wistfully that he still felt about China just the way King did. Go to the mouth of the Yangtze. Stay away from Kyushu, because there the people, Japanese, would oppose them fanatically, while on the China coast the civilians would be friendly. King suggested that the Japanese fleet might come out soon during these operations. Nimitz said he hoped so, because this would give the Americans the chance they had been waiting for. But if the Japanese did not, they would soon be destroyed without ever coming out. King wanted to know, why Iwo Jima? Nimitz said possession would give fighter protection to the B-29S, and the Army Air Force wanted such protection. Admiral Cook remarked that in the rest of 1944 they would not have much Japanese air opposition, but if they went into Iwo Jima they would have plenty of it again. Sherman replied that the fast carrier forces would wear down the Japanese air continually. Then, after Okinawa, they could open up the maritime provinces in May. Again they talked of the combined chiefs of staff and who liked the Kyushu operation. What did they think of China? Asked Nimitz. King said they implied that they liked it, but they did not actually say so. They talked about China and its future. King said American policy was to support Chiang with all possible Lend-Lease aid. Also discussed was the Marine Corps. Sherman said it would be difficult to use all 6 Marine divisions in 40 days for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They wanted Army replacement troops and more of them. When they discussed the uses of the fleet, Nimitz explained that he proposed to use Halsey to cover the Luzon operation and Spruance to handle the Iwo Jima and Okinawa operations. King very shrewdly remarked that it might be advisable to use Spruance as supporting force commander for Luzon and Halsey as head of the covering force, to stand by for the Japanese fleet. Would that not also work, with Halsey under Spruance, for Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Formosa? Obviously King was considering the proclivities of Nimitz's 2 fleet commanders. Nimitz said he was against such a program at the moment. A good deal of the meeting was devoted to public relations, because Secretary Forrestal was pressing very hard on that subject. By this time the Miller-Drake feud was raging, and the whole matter was settled by officially placing Captain Drake in Washington. There was much discussion of logistics and the growing variety of vessels in the fleet, and then the meetings ended, and Nimitz headed back for Pearl Harbor. Early in October, Halsey had a presentiment that the Japanese were going to move, and he meant the fleet. I feel sure the Japanese will be stung into attempting some sort of countermeasures, he wrote Nimitz. He has already made a token raid on Palau and sent some subs out, but that should only result in further byproducts of destruction, and I welcome it. A few hours later, Halsey was smarting under a lash from Pearl Harbor. He had arbitrarily relieved Clark of command and put McCain in charge of Task Group 38.1 without consulting Nimitz. The point was not what he did. Clark was destined for leave anyhow, and Halsey was showing no feeling against him, which Clark knew, but Nimitz insisted that the rights of command be left to him unless he delegated them. When Halsey was chastened, he apologized with the grace and honesty so characteristic of him. Nimitz, of course, accepted the explanation, and drafted in his own hand a reply for Halsey, which McMorris was to put in the form of a letter. "We must reserve the right to determine operations, except that he always acts in emergency situations, etc." Nimitz noted at the bottom of the Halsey letter. Here is how those notes were translated by McMorris in a formal letter to Halsey. "You are always free to make local decisions in connection with the handling of the forces placed under your command. Often it will be necessary for you to take action not previously contemplated because of local situations which may develop quickly and in the light of information which has come to you and which may not yet be available to me. My only requirement in such cases is that I be informed as fully and as early as the situation permits." The letter emphasized what Halsey wanted: power to make decisions, and it certainly was obvious from this correspondence that Halsey intended to take after the Japanese fleet at the very first opportunity. Captain Moore, Spruance's retiring chief of staff, said he was certain that Halsey's attitude was deeply coloured by Spruance's experience at the First Battle of the Philippine Sea. Moore explained, "I had been told, much later, that at Pearl Harbor Admiral Halsey, Admiral Calhoun, Admiral Towers, and the others who were around there at the time, after their daily meetings with Admiral Nimitz, would get together during this affair and just pan the whole thing. The discussions that went on there at that time, I have always thought, and I still believe, had a tremendous effect on Halsey, because in the operation plan that he wrote for the Palau attack and the Leyte Gulf attack, he said, 'If a situation arises or can be created for the defeat of the Japanese fleet, that will become the major objective. In other words, the hell with everything else.' Nimitz knew how Halsey felt, and he accepted that fact. In this letter of October 8th, setting forth what he expected in matters concerning control, Nimitz was full of praise for Halsey's carrier operations in the Philippines. "They are beyond praise, and will be remembered as long as we have a navy," he said. He noted Admiral Radford would be coming along in the Ticonderoga to join the force, and informed Halsey that in San Francisco it had been decided that the commander of the Third Fleet would remain at sea until the end of the year, handling the Philippine support, and that Spruance would then take over for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The decision indicated the judgment of Nimitz and King about their commanders. Halsey's task in the Philippines would be almost entirely to hunt the Japanese fleet and knock out Japanese air. Admiral Kinkaid's augmented 7th Fleet was really given responsibility for the management of the landings, with Rear Admiral Barbé occupying the place that Vice Admiral Turner had if Spruance was running the show with the 5th Fleet. In other words, while the 5th Fleet and 3rd Fleet were called interchangeable commands, they were not totally that. When the 5th Fleet was used, Spruance was given entire responsibility for the taking and holding of the territory, as well as protection from incursions of the Japanese fleet. When Halsey was used, his superiors knew that he would concentrate on the enemy navy, and the plans were made accordingly. As these letters of policy were being exchanged, Halsey was moving fast. On October 7th he had begun a new offensive. Rear Admiral Alan E. Smith hit Marcus Island on October 9th with 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers, in a deceptive move to indicate that a landing was planned on Marcus. Next day, Mitch's Task Force 38 hit Okinawa and the Ryukyus, flying nearly 1,400 sorties in one day. This particular strike brought the Japanese up short, and Admiral Toyoda, the chief of the combined fleet, made ready Operation Show 1. This operation was part of an overall Japanese defense plan known euphemistically as Shogo, or Victory Operation. Show 1 was to go into effect in case of an American landing in the Philippines. Show 2 meant Formosa Ryukyus. Show 3 meant Honshu Kyushu. Show 4 meant Hokkaido Kurils. Obviously, if Show 1 was to be in motion, the Japanese were expecting an invasion of the Philippines. It was a sign of their excellent intelligence. To carry out Show 1, the Japanese would transfer almost all their operational carrier planes to land bases, and this process was begun, stripping the carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, Ise, and Hyuga. The last two were battleships in the process of conversion to carriers. On October 11th, two of Halsey's groups hit the Philippines. On October 12th, the force began a 3-day strike on Formosa. The result was destruction of 500 Japanese planes, the wrecking of hangars and many other installations, sinking of some 40 ships of various kinds and sizes. The Americans suffered, however. The cruiser Canberra took a torpedo. The light cruiser Houston took 2 torpedoes. Halsey towed. In this instance, Morrison notes, Volraba 22, p. 71, that there was a bad leak somewhere in American diplomatic or military mission circles. In October, the Japanese ambassador to Moscow learned from the Soviet Foreign Office that the American 14th and 20th Air Forces were to make attacks designed to isolate the Philippines. On October 6th, the Japanese Naval High Command had that word. On October 7th, while visiting the Philippines to confer with Army and Navy commanders at Manila, Admiral Toyoda suggested that any day the Third Fleet might launch a massive carrier attack on Okinawa, Formosa, or the Philippines. Imperial General Headquarters predicted a landing on Leyte during the last 10 days of October, them both to safety at Ulithi. In the retirement to protect the cruisers, the American force was attacked by no fewer than 1,000 Japanese planes, but beat the attackers off without losing a ship. On October 17th, Halsey began his support of the Leyte landings, which would be staged 3 days later. The carriers struck repeatedly at various targets in the Philippines, as did Lieutenant General George Kenney's Far Eastern Air Forces coming up from the south. Somehow, knowing of the desperate air battles fought over the water of Formosa, the Japanese got the idea they had sunk most of the Third Fleet, and Radio Tokyo so announced. 11 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers and a destroyer were said to have gone to the bottom, and 8 carriers, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers and a destroyer were said to be damaged, plus 25 others. The Japanese army believed its own propaganda. The Japanese Navy did not. On October 17th, when the first ships of the American invading force were sighted off Suluan, the Emperor had issued a special imperial rescript on occasion of the great naval victory of Taiwan. The press had whooped it up, and the people had literally danced in the streets. But the Japanese Navy knew the invasion was about to begin. Suddenly, on October 19th, came a communiqué from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz has received from Admiral Halsey the comforting assurance that he is now retiring toward the enemy following the salvage of all the Third Fleet ships recently reported sunk by Radio Tokyo. The Great Battle of the Philippines was about to begin. Some 700 ships were to be used in the Central Philippines attack force. Most of these came from Nimitz, who lent them to MacArthur for the operation. This figure did not count Halsey's Third Fleet, with its 18 carriers, 6 battleships, 17 cruisers, 64 destroyers, and its train of supply ships and oilers. The Leyte invasion was commanded by General MacArthur, with Vice Admiral Kinkaid in the position that Spruance occupied in the Fifth Fleet operations. Under Kinkaid, Task Force 78 would hit in the north. This force was commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel Barbé. Task Force 79 would hit the southern area. This force was commanded by Vice Admiral T.S. Wilkinson. In support of Barbé was Rear Admiral G.L. Weiler with 3 battleships and 6 destroyers. In support of Wilkinson was Rear Admiral J.B. Oldendorf in the cruiser Louisville, with Battleship Division 2, with Rear Admiral T.E. Chandler and 3 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and a dozen destroyers. Of course, in the fleet there were additional dozens of destroyers in the screen. Near this fleet would be the escort carrier force of Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague, the force called Task Group 77.4, consisting of 18 escort carriers and a destroyer screen. There were other cruisers, torpedo boats, seaplane tenders, minesweepers, and dozens of other kinds of ships in this huge fleet. On October 17th, the Japanese sighted those first ships of the American van. Admiral Toyoda alerted all Japanese naval forces for Operation Show 1. The next day, as the Americans secured the entrance to Leyte Gulf, Admiral Toyoda gave the order to execute. In October 1944, Japan's naval power was centered in the first striking force. There were no carriers in this force. Since all the carriers had been stripped of their planes to augment the land-based air defences of the Empire, the carriers had been retired to Japan. Thus one might say that Japanese strategy, of necessity, had reverted to pre-World War II ideas. The first striking force consisted of the new battleships Yamato and Musashi, the old battleships Nagato, Fuso, Yamashiro, Kongo, and Haruna, the heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Haguro, Miyoko, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, Chikuma, and Mogami, the light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi, and 19 destroyers. The two new battleships were the world's largest fighting ships, displacing 68,000 tons each and carrying 18-inch guns. This force left Lingga Roads, off Singapore, on October 18th at 0100 and moved into Brunei Bay in North Borneo, where Admiral Kurita awaited his special instructions. On October 20th, the second move in the Showan plan began. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sailed with the Northern Force from Japan. Part of this force was located in Kure and part in Beppu Bay. The two parts met in Bungo Swedo and went out together through this southwestern channel entrance into the inland sea. They had expected to encounter packs of American submarines, but the submarines were not there. This force consisted of the Ise and Hyuga, the two battleships that had been converted to carriers, the fleet carrier Zuikaku, and the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. These carriers were screened by the light cruisers Oyodo, Tama, Isuzu, and by 8 destroyers. This northern force of Admiral Ozawa's was strictly expendable. It was expected, in fact, that the entire force would be lost. The 6 carriers had only 116 planes aboard. The Japanese factories were working night and day to build planes, but they would be thrown into the air pipeline and delivered by hopping from island to island. The Americans had breached the inner line of defences of the Empire. Japan's fight now was for a sea empire dotted throughout with island airfields. If any ships could be sacrificed at this stage of the war, it was the carriers. Admiral Ozawa's unhappy but heroic task was to martyr himself and his force, to move down from the north so that the force would be seen and heard by Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, and then to decoy Admiral Halsey and that fleet up northeast of Luzon, away from Philippine waters. On October 20th, as Ozawa headed south, Admiral Kurita received his orders. At 0800 on the morning of October 22nd, Kurita sailed with his force, from which he detached the old battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, and the heavy cruiser Mogami. Kurita then had 2 new battleships, 3 old battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers plus destroyers. Later that day, Vice Admiral Nishimura took the old battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, and made a detour to the north. Then he moved toward Balabac Strait into the Sulu Sea, heading for Surigao Strait, the southern entrance into Leyte Gulf. At the same time, Vice Admiral Shima was moving down from the north with the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara, the light cruiser Abukuma, and 4 destroyers. The plan called for Ozawa to lure Halsey away, and for Kurita to rush through San Bernardino Strait, which runs between Samar and Luzon Island. Kurita could then whisk southeast around Samar and surprise the Americans in Leyte Gulf, coming down from the northeast, while Nishimura and Shima would come rushing up from the south through Surigao Strait, which runs between Leyte and Mindanao, and catch the Americans from the southern side. The American ships would be unloading their cargoes and their invasion troops, and would be sitting ducks, ready for the slaughter. Meanwhile, Halsey would be hundreds of miles away to the northeast, destroying the carriers, which were of relatively little use anyhow. If enough damage were done, the American invasion could be stopped, and the Japanese forces would have time to regroup and even rebuild their air defences. At daybreak on October 20th, the ships of Admiral Barbe's Northern Force and Admiral Wilkinson's Southern Force began to move into Leyte Gulf, Barbe to San Pedro Bay near Tacloban, and Wilkinson 11 miles south of Palo, on Barbe's left flank. The army forces landed successfully, and the battle for the Philippines land area began. The Japanese began fighting back with artillery and airstrikes. The landing plans had been made with the usual thought of getting the ships unloaded and out of the way in case of Japanese naval attack, and this procedure was followed. 2 days later, Admiral Halsey assessed the situation in a letter to Nimitz. Mitcher, said Halsey, was certain that Japanese naval air was virtually wiped out. Mitcher based that view on his observations of the result of his operations that summer, and particularly on the results of the last few days of strikes in the Formosa and Luzon areas. Noting the strange assortment of planes that the Japanese threw up from Formosa, Mitcher was sure the enemy would not have risked so many non-fighting types had he not been desperate. He also pointed to the very noticeable lack of skill of many of the pilots who manned these planes. Halsey, however, was not convinced. "I believe that the prudent view requires withholding judgment, and also requires the assumption that the enemy still has some carrier air strength up his sleeve." He had no positive information, he said, concerning the Japanese carriers, except the knowledge that some carrier-type planes had come to meet them off Formosa. He wondered where the Japanese carriers were and what they were doing. Halsey had observed that the Japanese found it impossible to react to an attack in an unexpected quarter in less than a few days, quite unlike the South Pacific period. This inability held true as far as Okinawa. He was ready to test it on the Inner Empire. As for the Japanese fleet, he still felt that it would come out, but only when the chances of success looked very good. Halsey said he was much impressed with MacArthur's landing, and was then just waiting for MacArthur's men to consolidate enough to justify the Third Fleet's withdrawal to rearm for future operations. McCain in Task Group 38.1 and Admiral Davison in Task Group 38.4 were off Leyte supporting the escort carriers. Admiral Bogan in Task Group 38.2 and Admiral Frederick Sherman in Task Group. 38.3 stood east of Cape San Ildefonso to hit any Japanese naval forces that might try to break up the landing. The Japanese air situation in the beginning was desperate. It was doubtful if they had 100 planes in operation on invasion day, so successful had been the strikes of carrier and land-based aircraft. But within a few hours the call for help was being answered, and planes were in the inter-island pipelines coming from Japan and Formosa. On October 22nd, as Halsey wondered about the Japanese fleet, Admiral Kurita was moving northeast through Palawan Passage into the South China Sea that abuts the Philippines. There his force was spotted by the American submarines Data and Dace, which sent the word by radio to Australia. Early on the morning of October 23rd, Halsey had the message too. Data and Dace attacked. Data put 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Atago, Admiral Kurita's flagship, and 2 torpedoes into Takao. Atago sank. Takao made her way back to a Japanese base. Meanwhile, Das sank the heavy cruiser Maya. On October 23rd, Halsey's intelligence officers knew that 2 forces were moving in on Leyte Gulf from the south, while one was coming down from the northwest. Kurita's force had been seen already, and Nishimura and Shima had been spotted. Only Ozawa, who wanted to be discovered, had not yet made his presence known. On October 21st, having decided that the MacArthur landings were consolidated enough so that Kincaid's 7th Fleet could handle any problems, Halsey had detached Admiral McCain's task group and sent it to Ulithi for resupply. Halsey dispersed his other 3 task forces so they might make searches fanning out to the west from the islands. Sherman's force was off the Polillo Islands. Bogan was off San Bernardino Strait. Davison was off Surigao Strait. On the morning of October 24th, Bogan's search planes found Kurita's force. Within half an hour, Halsey had ordered the other 2 task groups on station to close on Bogan, and McCain to reverse course and prepare to refuel at sea instead of at Ulithi, and all groups were told to strike the enemy. Halsey did all this, not Mitcher, for with Halsey in command there was no need for a task force commander within the fleet. Halsey was fleet commander and task force commander in one, and Mitcher was very much the patient bystander. That morning the Japanese had land-based air reinforcements in the Philippines, and they struck at the task groups. They bombed the Princeton in Admiral Sherman's group, and after valiant attempts to save her failed, she had to be sunk by torpedo. That day, the American carrier planes hit the super battleship Musashi with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, and sank her. Yamato and Nagato were both damaged, but they could still fight. The heavy cruiser Miyoko was torpedoed and had to return to Brunei. These were the results of the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, in which 18 planes were lost by the Americans. The Shoone plan called for Kurita to meet with Nishimura and Shima at dawn inside Leyte Gulf, and then in daylight to shoot up the sitting ducks of the American landing force. After this day of strikes by Halsey's planes, Kurita's force was diminished and mauled, and he turned away west as if retiring. He was simply manoeuvring for time, but he was also upsetting the schedule of Show 1. Meanwhile, that same morning of October 24th, Admiral Nishimura's force was spotted by planes from the carriers Enterprise and Franklin of Admiral Davison's Task Group 38.4 south of Island, and Admiral Shima's force was found by an Army Air Force bomber near the Cagayan Islands. Planes hit Nishimura's force, but damaged only the Fuso and one destroyer. Davison had to break off the attack because he was ordered north to close on Bogan and hit the Kurita force that day. So Nishimura steamed on. Admiral Kinkaid was aware of Nishimura's coming and disposed his forces so the Japanese would have to fight their way through Surigao Strait. At 11:45, Admiral Ozawa's force, coming down from Japan, was 210 miles northeast of Sherman's Task Group 38.3, and the Japanese launched a strike of 76 planes. The Japanese admiral then began maneuvering in a rectangle, so the Americans might discover and chase him. The Ozawa airstrike came to nothing. The planes landed on Luzon to join the land-based air. The converted battleships Ise and Hyuga were detached and sent south to battle the Americans. They carried no planes, but they each still had 8 14-inch guns, which made them formidable enough. Late in the afternoon, planes of Halsey's force sighted the Ozawa carrier force, 4 carriers, 2 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers. Halsey then had the complete picture. He knew of the existence of all the forces at sea. He assumed that all these forces were planning to rendezvous early in the morning to attack the American ships in the Leyte Gulf. He lacked only 2 bits of essential information. 1, that the Kurita force was the strongest force and was still coming in, and 2, that the carrier force, apparently the attack force, was a hollow shell, and a diversionary rabbit at that. Halsey believed in the American carrier doctrine: hit the carriers and hit them first before they can hit you. He wrote off the southern force. Kinkaid could handle that. He wrote off the central force. His pilots indicated that it was decimated. He decided then that he would go after the carriers. He might have left his battleships to guard San Bernardino Strait, but he rejected the idea of splitting his fleet. So Halsey did precisely what the Japanese wanted him to do. He went after the diversionary force, as Admiral Kurita moved into San Bernardino Strait. The information about the disposition and movement of Kurita and the other forces was available. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison indicates that Halsey's own task group commanders knew Kurita was coming in and tried to warn their commander, but Halsey's staff protected him from the information. Off went the Third Fleet, like a posse bent on heading off the bad guys at the pass, while the bad guys' Confederates steamed on toward the heart of the American invasion fleet. Rear Admiral Ching Lee, the commander of the fast battleships, suggested to Halsey that the northern force was a decoy and that Kurita would turn around and come through San Bernardino Strait. He received an acknowledgement of that message, but no reply. A little later, Lee reiterated his worry that Kurita would be coming through. This time there was not even an acknowledgement, and since it was Halsey's show, Lee kept quiet, as a junior admiral is supposed to do. Aboard the Lexington Admiral Mitcher, who knew his Halsey, prepared to turn in for the night, around 20:30, expecting to be up at dawn. Before he left his bridge, Commodore Arleigh Burke, his chief of staff, suggested that they check on the whereabouts of the Kurita force. They did check, and found that Kurita was coming through the strait. At noon on October 24th, Vice Admiral Kinkaid was prepared to fight the Japanese in a night engagement. He expected Admiral Nishimura at Surigao Strait that night. Rear Admiral J.B. Oldendorf, the commander of the Bombardment and Fire Support Group, was told to be ready to meet the enemy there. On the left flank, up to the northeast, would be Oldendorf himself, with 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. In the centre, across the entrance to San Pedro Bay, where the supply ships were anchored, stood the battle line, 6 old battleships and 6 destroyers. Behind them were 28 Liberty ships, 3 amphibious force flagships, which were heavy on communications equipment and anti-aircraft guns, but light on big gun firepower, and the cruiser Nashville, in which rode General MacArthur. Off to the right flank, against Leyte and looking south, were 2 light cruisers, a heavy cruiser, and 6 destroyers. And far out in front was the picket patrol of 7 destroyers. The force was quite adequate for protection against the Japanese who would come up through Surigao Strait, and along the edges and down the Mindanao Sea as far as Camiguin Island were 39 PT boats strung out. None of these forces knew that Admiral Nishimura and Admiral Shima were both coming in independently, but there was plenty of power here for both Japanese forces. The Shoone plan called for Nishimura to come through Surigao Strait and arrive off Tacloban at dawn. Kurita would come through San Bernardino and arrive there at the same time. In spite of the attack on Kurita, Admiral Toyoda that night confirmed the fact that the plan was still in effect. About 22:30 that night, Nishimura came in next to Bohol Island and was spotted on radar by PT-131. 20 minutes later, the PT boat sighted the enemy. The PT boat and others attacked, without effect. But just after midnight, Admiral Oldendorf had the word. The Japanese were entering the strait. Nishimura's force began running the gauntlet of PT boats, which were very effective that night as eyes of the fleet, although totally ineffective as torpedo boats. Within 15 minutes, too, Oldendorf learned that he also had the Shima force to contend with. Out in front of the American forces were the picket destroyers, under Captain J.G. Coward. He planned a destroyer torpedo attack on the Japanese. He left 2 destroyers on picket duty, took 3 himself on the eastern side of the strait, and assigned 2 others on the west under Commander R.H. Phillips. They came in fast, fired 27 torpedoes, swung hard a port, and retired. Japanese shells were falling all about them, but they zigzagged and kept clear of every shot. Explosions were heard, and Fuso began to slow down. From the other side, the 2 destroyers under Commander Phillips, McDermott and Monson, dashed in for a second attack. McDermott's torpedoes hit 3 Japanese destroyers. The first, Yamagumo, blew up and sank. The second, Michishio, began sinking. The third, Asagumo, had her bow blown off but began limping home. Monson put at least 1 torpedo into the battleship Yamashiro but did not stop her. These were only the pickets. Admiral Nishimura steamed on into the jaws of Oldendorf's battle force. The other destroyers attacked without much effect, except to sink Michishio and to put 2 torpedoes into Yamashiro at the very end of the destroyer rush. The destroyer Albert W. Grant was hit and stopped dead in the water, but later was saved. Admiral Nishimura's column was now 1 battleship, 1 heavy cruiser, and 1 destroyer. The striking power of the heavy American ships was concentrated on Yamashiro, already crippled. She began to burn, she turned to retire, and then, 10 minutes later, capsized and sank, taking down Admiral Nishimura. The cruiser Mogami began to retire, with destroyer Shiguro. Mogami had taken many hits, and her commanding officer was killed, but she got away. So, just after 0400 in the morning of October 25th, the first phase of the battle was over. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships, 2 destroyers, 1 cruiser, and 2 damaged destroyers were limping home. Admiral Shima was coming on behind, unwarned. At 0330 hours, PT-137 put a torpedo into the light cruiser Abukuma, and she fell out of formation. Shima then had 2 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. Shima came in, fired 8 torpedoes at 2 small islands seen dimly through the night, and retired. When he retired, Nachi collided with Mogami of the Nishimura force, adding to the damage and confusion. Then began a chase, which lasted much of the next day. The destroyer Asugumo, with her broken bow, was sunk by gunfire. Mogami was hit by carrier planes from Admiral Sprague's escort carriers. Abukuma was hit by Army Air Force planes and sank southwest. The only survivor of Nishimura's force was the destroyer Shiguro, which made Brunei Bay. That was the end of the Battle of Surigao Strait. All this while, Admiral Kurita was moving through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Admiral Kincaid was sure that Admiral Halsey was covering that area for him. At 0645 hours, however, the pagoda masts of the Japanese battleships were seen by the escort carriers off Leyte Gulf, just as the Japanese ships began opening fire, coming down from the north. Here they came, the destroyer screen standing off to the east, then 4 heavy cruisers, 2 more heavy cruisers, and a destroyer squadron on the west. Behind were battleships Yamato and Nagato, then the battleships Kongo and Haruna, on the same plane as the other battleships. Out on the flanks were the light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi. At 0645, Kurita had ordered his ships to attack the carriers. He gave no plan, no battle line, no formation of any kind. Off they were to go, to shoot up the Americans. The American force consisted of 3 escort carrier units. Rear Admiral T.L. Sprague, the overall commander of the carriers, had one, called Taffy 1, which included 4 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Rear Admiral Felix B. Stump had 2 escort carriers, plus 4 more under Rear Admiral W.D. Sample in Stump's Taffy 2, then 3 destroyers and 4 escorts for screen. Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Caff Sprague consisted of 4 escort carriers, plus Carrier Division 26 under Rear Admiral Ralph A. Ofsty, Nimitz's old air officer, and 3 destroyers and 4 escorts for screen. The Japanese had come upon Taffy 3. Now the air began to crackle with calls for assistance from the escort carriers, and Kincaid quickly gave permission to launch all available planes everywhere to repel this surprise attack. Sprague began making smoke in his 6 carriers and launched all planes. The carriers moved into a circle, and the destroyers screened them. The Japanese began to find the range, and soon were straddling at least 2 of the escort carriers. Then came a rain squall, and Sprague's carriers ducked inside. Sprague's destroyers went in to attack with torpedoes. 1 or more hit the heavy cruiser Kumano and knocked her out of the fight. Heavy cruiser Suzuya was hit by bombs and also put out of the fight. 2 of the American destroyers were hit. The battleship Yamato began maneuvering to miss torpedoes and maneuvered herself out of the battle. The American forces did not come through unscathed. The destroyer Hoel took some 40 shells from Japanese guns, from 16-inch to 5-inch, but she managed to remain afloat until almost 0900, serving as a focal point for the Japanese and, in a manner of speaking, distracting them. They were also distracted by the destroyer torpedo attacks, followed by the destroyer escort torpedo attacks. One of the destroyers, Johnston, even took on the battleship Congo in a gun battle and fired 30 shells. The captain said half of them hit, but it was like bouncing paper spitwads off a steel helmet, and as the battleship began firing back at them with 14-inch guns, Johnston ducked into its own smoke cloud. The destroyers and escorts circled about their charges, so many buzzing bees to threaten the Japanese bee-eaters, but all too soon the stings of the bees were drawn. The whole force had been low on ammunition to begin with, because much had been expended on shore targets during the landings. The torpedoes were soon fired, and several destroyers and escorts found themselves almost without any stings at all. The Japanese moved forward, apparently indomitable. D.D. Samuel B. Roberts was hit by several shells, and then by 2 14 inches together, and completely smashed abaft the smokestack. She sank just after 1,000. Several of the destroyers set out, with smoke and their 5-inch guns, to divert the heavy cruisers from the escort carriers. Heermann took several hits from Chikuma, but forged on. Johnston tore in like a bulldog against a pack and held a whole destroyer squadron at bay, deflecting a torpedo attack on the escort carriers, but she took the brunt herself. The destroyers closed on her, circled her, and poured shells into the American destroyer until she capsized and sank at 10:10. All this while, the escort carriers were launching planes to defend themselves by attacking the enemy. Kalinin Bay was the first carrier hit, but she was not disabled until she took one 14-inch or 16-inch shell and about a dozen 8-inch shells, apparently from a battleship. Fanshawe Bay was hit 4 times by 8-inch shells. White Plains was hit with 6-inch shells, and Kitkun Bay was hurt by several near misses. The carriers launched as quickly as they could, and by 0730 the planes were in the air. For 2 hours they attacked, some armed with torpedoes, some with bombs, some with 100-pound anti-personnel bombs. When they expended their drops, they came down to strafe or made dry runs, and so did the fighters, anything to divert the Japanese. If the destroyers were bees buzzing about the Japanese force, the planes were angry gnats, but some of them carried real stings. They did divert the Japanese, but not totally. Gambia Bay was hit repeatedly by the heavy cruisers, and just after 0900 she sank. But one of her assailants, Chokai, was attacked by the bombers and sank at 0930. On the day before, Admiral Kincaid had ordered the escort carriers to load torpedoes, thinking they might be needed in the Surigao Strait battle. So the carriers were ready, or almost ready. Marcus Island's TBMS, torpedo bombers, had mostly gone off on a mercy mission, carrying water and food for troops of the 96th Division cut off from their supplies on Leyte. Knowing in this desperate situation that the Japanese must be turned back, Rear Admiral Stump ordered his Taffy 2 planes to scatter about and hit as many ships as possible, rather than try to destroy a few. In an hour and a half, he launched 36 fighters and 43 torpedo bombers. The other escort forces also launched as quickly as they could and kept the gnats moving. Shortly after 0900, the Japanese attack showed signs of faltering. The heavy cruisers, Haguro and Tone, broke off the attack. The other 2 heavy cruisers, Chokai and Chikuma, were sunk by the combined attacks of the US destroyers, escorts, and the planes. Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet north just after 0900 in order to reform. But he drove north for an hour and a half, then west, then southwest, which indicated he was coming in again, and then back north again. This activity took about 3 hours, and at the end of it Kurita had passed the latitude of the battle, out at sea, and was heading back for San Bernardino Strait, having decided against hitting Leyte Gulf again. All during that manoeuvring, Admiral Kurita had been making up his mind. What apparently frightened him off, with his 4 battleships and his destroyers, was the knowledge that somewhere around was the fearsome Third Fleet, and Kincaid was calling for it, in messages in the clear. Still, while the outright danger of disaster from the sea was over, as Admiral Kurita moved away, a new element in the war appeared over Leyte Gulf that morning of October 25th. It was the kamikaze, or suicide plane. A few days before, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi had come to the Philippines as commander of the 5th Base Air Force. Onishi was a sturdy fighter with an indomitable will to win for the Emperor. He moved about the islands, from airfield to airfield, and might have been disheartened by what he saw. In comparison to the early days of the war, there were only a handful of planes that could fly, and only a ragtag remnant of the proud Naval Air Force to fly them. Most of his pilots could neither maneuver nor shoot very well. Onishi, however, was beyond dismay. He had one major asset with which to work: the intense patriotism and will to fight of the Japanese pilots, no matter how bad their equipment, how weak their physical condition, how poor their training. Immediately, Admiral Onishi began the preparations to make use of this asset in the Battle of the Philippines. It was a relatively simple job. First, his mechanics had to prepare the planes, putting explosive charges in them, making them into flying bombs. Second, Onishi had to create, by speech and mystique, the conditions under which the pilots would sacrifice themselves. But since Japanese folklore was replete with the stories of the self-sacrifice of the old samurai, it was not hard to convince the pilots that their responsibility was to make the supreme sacrifice. By October 25th, all was ready on the airfield where Onishi would launch his first attack. That nightmare, as seen from the receiving end, arrived over the escort carrier Santee at about 0745 in the morning. A second kamikaze was splashed by gunfire from the Suwannee, and a third barely missed Petrov Bay. Then there were many others. Just before 1100, one crashed into St. Lo and exploded her torpedoes and bombs. St. Lo went down in a few minutes. Then there was a respite, although for the next few days the area would be invaded again by Japanese submarines, and more kamikazes would take their toll. In fact, the Americans were not to be free of the kamikaze threat again as long as the war lasted, and could not devise a really satisfactory defense against men who were willing to sacrifice their lives to hit a ship. The retreat of Admiral Kurita through San Bernardino Strait became a rout. No longer did he have the element of surprise, which had made up for the lack of air power in his force. Running home, the heavy cruiser Suzuya found herself in trouble after having taken much punishment off Leyte Gulf. She foundered early on the afternoon of October 25th, having been passed over by American bombers seeking unhurt targets. Those bombers found Kurita off Samar around noon. A bomb hit Nagato, doing slight damage. One hit Tone, temporarily wrecking the steering gear. If Admiral Kurita had not made up his mind, this attack made it up for him. He headed home, and just about then the Third Fleet swung into action. On the evening of October 23rd, when Admiral Halsey made the decision to go after Admiral Ozawa's northern force, he ordered Admiral McCain's Task Group 34.1 to close up and joint the fleet, Bogan and Davison to head due north at 25 knots, and Sherman to hook on as the fleet sped by him. He sent a message to Admiral Kinkaid. Central Force heavily damaged according to strike reports, XAM proceeding north with 3 groups to attack Carrier Force at dawn. This message would seem to be a clear enough indication that Halsey was heading out, leaving San Bernardino Strait. But a lot had gone on beforehand. First of all, although Halsey had made it plain to Nimitz and all others with whom he corresponded in this period that he was itching to get at the Japanese fleet and would never let happen to him what had happened to Spruance, still Kinkaid, being in MacArthur's navy, was not really party to Halsey's thinking. Nor did these two admirals have a specific understanding. Both were somewhat confused about what their course would be in the event of a Japanese attack. And finally, an ironic fate played one of its startling cards. Spruance had based his decision at the Marianas on the known fleet tactics of the Japanese, which called for a split of forces and a pincers movement, and the Japanese had actually put all their fish in one barrel that day. Halsey estimated that the big Japanese fish were in the northern barrel, but they actually were not. Early on the morning of October 24th, Task Force 34 went into action. Halsey used the night carrier Independence, marking a first in naval aviation. Her planes flew out and found the Japanese in the dark, and by 0230 Halsey knew where his enemy was located. At 0630, the planes began to take off from the day carriers. On the day before, Halsey had laid out a plan of battle involving the detachment of Ching Li's fast battleships as a striking force to hit the enemy surface fleet. Halsey had meant this as tentative, but when Kinkaid picked up a dispatch noting the plan, Kinkaid put it down as a definite plan of action. Now, on the morning of October 25th, with Kurita's force moving down from San Bernardino Strait, Kinkaid asked the question, "Am now engaging enemy surface forces Surigao Strait. X question is TF-34 guarding San Bernardino Strait." That, TF-34, meant the battleships. Halsey had to answer that Task Force 34 was with the carriers. The planes were out. The carrier groups were committed. The carriers, at least, could not turn around without throwing the whole organization into confusion. Halsey steamed on. A succession of messages caught him as he moved northward. At 0822, he learned that the Kurita force had come through San Bernardino Strait and was firing on the escort carriers. At 0830, Kinkaid said he needed the fast battleships at once at Leyte Gulf. In his book and in his private papers, which are in the possession of the Naval History Division U.S. Navy, There is no evidence to deny that the decisions made this night were all Halsey's, and all based on the total information available to him. It has been suggested, however, Morrison hints at it, Volterton, pp. 195 and 96, that Halsey was the victim of bad work or carelessness by his personal staff. The facts are not known. They may be clarified to some extent in the future when the papers of Admiral R.B. Kearney are made available to historians and writers. Kearney, Halsey's chief of staff, was on the bridge with him on the night of this battle. By Kearney's wish, his papers are sequestered as of 1970, and this author was unable to secure an interview with him. Just about this time, the pilots said 0800, the Japanese said 0830, the American carrier planes found Admiral Ozawa's force. Carrier Zuiho launched a few planes, then was hit by a bomb, which damaged but did not sink her. Carrier Chitos was bombed and began to sink. Carrier Zuikaku, veteran of so many battles, was hit by a torpedo and listed so badly that Admiral Ozawa shifted his flag off of her. Destroyer Akatsuki was sunk, and 9 Japanese planes were shot down. Carrier Chiyoda was hit. She later sank. Light cruiser Tama was hit. She slowed and began trailing oil. Halsey's reaction, as he awaited the results of Mitcher's airstrikes and considered what was occurring back at Leyte, was to wonder why the search planes of the escort carriers had not found the Kurita force before it found them. It was a good question. Later, Admiral King investigated and came to the conclusion that Kincaid's searchers had been remiss. Kincaid, of course, had been counting on Halsey to take care of everything in that northern sector. When the call for the battleships came, Halsey would not respond in time to get them there. "It was not my job to protect the 7th Fleet," he wrote later. "My job was offensive, to strike with the 3rd Fleet, and we were even then rushing to intercept a force which gravely threatened not only Kincaid and myself, but the whole Pacific strategy." Halsey did send Admiral McCain a message, ordering him to strike the Kurita force, and by afternoon on October 25th, McCain's planes were harrying Kurita as he headed home. At 0900, Kincaid became more insistent. He asked that Halsey send Lee and the battleships down to Leyte, and that the fast carriers make an immediate strike on Kurita. At 0922, Kincaid again asked for help, and this time said his old battleships were low on ammunition. Checking, Halsey found this was an earlier dispatch, but it had somehow been delayed in reaching him. Halsey was too far away to send the fast battleships. He so informed Kincaid, and told him again that McCain was on his way with 5 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers. At 1000, Halsey received 2 dispatches. One was from Kincaid. "Where is Lee X? Send Lee." It was sent in the clear, which impressed Halsey more than the message. The second message was from Nimitz, asking in effect where Halsey was in time of trouble. Admiral Halsey was first stunned, then furious. At about this same time he had the results of his airstrikes. Chitose was sunk, Chiyoda was dead in the water. Things were going very nicely indeed. He estimated that he and the battleships were about 50 miles from the Japanese, and could finish them off with the big guns. He stopped for a moment to think. Elsewhere much was being thought about Halsey too. At headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had been aware of developing action since the afternoon of October 24th. He had learned with pleasure of the results of the Battle of Surigao Strait. And then, bucketing into headquarters that morning, had come that frightful message announcing the attack of Japanese ships on Admiral Sprague's TU task units, April 3, 77, in Leyte Gulf. Worried, Nimitz called Captain Austin, his flag secretary, and asked him what he thought. The suspense continued, almost unbearably. Finally, Nimitz composed a message to Halsey. "Where is Task Force 34 inches, that was all. No chiding, unless the fact that Nimitz had to ask at all was chiding.